As the first snow of winter blankets St. Mary Mead in a shimmering white silence, the village prepares for a season of warmth and cheer. But beneath the calm lies a secret, one that will shatter long-kept friendships, threaten reputations, and pull Miss Marple into one of the most puzzling betrayals the village has ever seen. When an unexpected incident disrupts the peace it whispers begin to drift through the frosted air. Chapter 1. The snow arrives in St. Mary Mead. The first snowfall of the season had draped St. Mary Mead in a soft, cotton-like white, the kind that muffled the crunch of footsteps and transformed every hedge, roof, and lamp-post into something out of a Christmas card illustration. Smoke rose in thin trails from chimneys twisting into the pale gray morning sky, and the scent of burning wood hovered pleasantly over the quaint cottages. It was the sort of morning that made one grateful for warm slippers, a crackling fire, and a cup of strong, grounded tea. In her neat, lace-curtained sitting room, Miss Jane Marple sat precisely thus, wrapped in a pale blue shawl, hands delicately cupped around a porcelain teacup. Her eyes, bright and observant even at the age of 75, lingered on the frost patterns blossoming on the window pane. To the untrained viewer, they were merely pretty little shapes. To Miss Marple, they were reminders that beauty often concealed complexity. Nature, like human nature, was never as simple as it appeared. She took a gentle sip, humming thoughtfully. The village had been unusually lively these past 2 days. There were holiday preparations, of course. Mrs. Phillips organizing the church bazaar with the sort of single-minded zeal that suggested she could successfully plan an invasion if she wished. Colonel Melrose had been boasting about his special winter ration of brandy, which he claimed would ward off all colds known to man. And Mr. Denwood, the new caretaker of Winterbrook Lodge, had been seen bustling about the property at ungodly hours, muttering about faulty pipes and mysterious drafts. But it wasn't any of those matters that concerned Miss Marple this morning. Instead, her attention drifted repeatedly toward the north end of the village, the direction of Frost Hollow Manor, a handsome but slightly neglected estate that had recently come under the management of Mrs. Constance Whitfield, a widow with an impeccable reputation, refined manners, and an unmistakable air of loneliness about her. She had arrived in St. Mary Mead barely 8 months ago, and despite her polite efforts to integrate, she remained something of an enigma. It was precisely at Frost Hollow Manor where the village was due to gather that afternoon for a charitable winter luncheon. Mrs. Whitfield had insisted upon hosting it as her humble contribution to the season, though most villagers suspected she wished more to quell the swirling rumors regarding her valuable inheritance. A rumored dispute with her late husband's family and an unfortunate incident involving a missing heirloom brooch last summer. Miss Marple didn't indulge in rumors, not in the way others did, but she listened. Listening often led one to the truth. A soft knock came at the door. Come in," Miss Marple called, putting her cup aside as her housemaid for the morning, young Lily Townsend, pushed through the door with a flurry of cold air. "Oh, Miss Marple, the snow's getting thicker by the minute. My toes have gone numb twice already." Lily rubbed her gloved hands together and stomped her boots lightly on the mat. "My dear girl, do warm yourself," Miss Marple said kindly. "And do close the door before the rest of the snow decides to join us." Lily complied, eyes wide with eagerness. "Have you heard the gossip? Mrs. Hartwell says something dreadful happened at Frost Hollow Manor this morning." Miss Marple raised a delicate brow. "Something dreadful? At this hour?" That's what she said. She couldn't give the details because, well, Mrs. Hartwell doesn't like being the one to spread nonsense, as she puts it. But she said something was seen by the milkman. Something odd. Odd, Miss Marple repeated, leaning back with interest. Not necessarily dreadful, then. I suppose it depends on how one sees it. Lily paused before continuing breathlessly. Mrs. Hartwell hinted that Mrs. Whitfield sounded quite shaken. The milkman said she was pale as a ghost when she came to the door, and the police were sent for. Miss Marple blinked. The police? Yes, miss. Well, Miss Marple murmured, that does elevate things somewhat. Lily began collecting the empty side plate from the coffee table, but paused. Do you think something serious has happened? Might it ruin the luncheon? I was ever so excited. Mrs. Whitfield's cook makes the loveliest scones. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gazed once more through the frosted window, thinking. Police involvement often suggested either urgency or confusion, and both were excellent clues. Thank you, Lily. You've given me quite a bit to ponder. She smiled gently. Now run along, dear. Do warm yourself properly at the kitchen stove. Lily left with a slight bob of her head, though she cast one final glance over her shoulder, clearly dying to know more. But Miss Marple merely chuckled softly as she returned her attention to her nearly empty cup. A disturbance at Frost Hollow Manor on the morning of a village gathering was certainly noteworthy, and concerning that the police had been summoned. Mrs. Whitfield was not the sort of woman to overreact. Miss Marple wrapped her shawl tighter, then rose with calm purpose. She intended to make her way to Frost Hollow Manor at once. Miss Marple stepped outside carefully, adjusting her sturdy winter boots. The air hit her face with a sting of crisp cold, and she inhaled deeply. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, each settling with a silent whisper. The path leading from her cottage curved around the churchyard before joining the main road. A modest stretch, but today it felt longer, quieter, more mysterious. A few villagers were out, bundled in heavy coats and scarves. Most stopped to greet her. Others whispered among themselves, glancing often toward the distant silhouette of Frost Hollow Manor perched on a slight hill. "Morning, Miss Marple," called Mr. Harper, the postman, his nose red as a berry. "Heading toward Frost Hollow, are you?" "I might be," Miss Marple said, offering a mild smile. "Are you delivering there today?" "Supposed to, but the constable's already there. Something strange going on." The milkman said he found the main gate open at 6:30, wide open, and that's not like Mrs. Whitfield at all. She's particular about those things. "So she is," Miss Marple agreed. "Well, best be careful, ma'am. Roads are slippery." He tipped his cap and trudged away. Miss Marple pressed on. Her pace was slow but deliberate, her eyes scanning subtle details, the pattern of footprints, the distinct drag marks of something heavy having been moved, the frosty edges of hedges where someone had brushed by recently. Every small thing was a note in a composition only she seemed to hear. When Frost Hollow Manor came into view, it was as striking as ever. The estate's stone facade was dusted with snow, and its tall windows reflected the pale daylight with a muted gleam. Yet something about the scene felt disrupted. A police motor car sat outside, its tires half buried in the accumulating snow. Constable Arthur Beckley stood at the front step, speaking with the anxious-looking cook, Mrs. Dunn, whose apron appeared more crumpled than usual. Miss Marple approached politely. "Good morning, Constable," she greeted. "I do hope I'm not interrupting." Beckley, a somewhat clumsy but well-meaning young man, straightened at once. "Miss Marple, oh no, not interrupting, just finishing a few questions, but perhaps this isn't the best time to, socialize." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said. "I merely wish to inquire if Mrs. Whitfield is well. I heard she was troubled this morning." Mrs. Dunn burst before Beckley could answer. "Troubled? That's putting it lightly, Miss Marple. Poor madam's beside herself, a terrible thing, terrible. And on the very morning of her luncheon, she says she'll have to cancel the whole affair." "Oh dear," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically. "May one inquire as to the nature of this terrible thing?" Beckley cleared his throat. Now, Mrs. Dunn, best not to alarm the whole village, but since Miss Marple here has a knack for noticing things—" "A habit," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Not a knack." "Quite right," Beckley said, though he plainly didn't understand the distinction. "Well, something's gone missing. And not just anything, something important to Mrs. Whitfield." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I see. That must be distressing indeed. Which item, if I may be so bold, has disappeared?" Mrs. Dunn wrung her hands. "Her late husband's winter ledger, a whole book of records, notes, and personal business. She keeps it in the study, but it's gone. Vanished. And there's no sign of forced entry at all." Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. A missing ledger. No forced entry. The main gate standing open at dawn. "How unusual," she said at last. "May I ask where Mrs. Whitfield is presently?" "Inside, miss," Mrs. Dunn said, shaken. She won't even touch her tea, which was the first sign something was really wrong. "At such a moment," Miss Marple nodded gently, "tea does tend to lose its appeal." Beckley stepped aside. "If she's up to visitors, she might appreciate your company. She trusts you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple thanked him, brushing a bit of snow off her shawl, and followed the walkway into the grand front hall of the manor. Inside, the warmth of the fireplaces enveloped her. The interior was polished yet quiet, decorated tastefully in soft creams and dark oaks. But even without speaking to anyone, Miss Marple sensed an unsettled undertone in the atmosphere, much like the stillness before a storm. Mrs. Whitfield sat in the drawing room, a handkerchief clenched between delicate fingers. She was a pale, graceful figure dressed in a dark wool gown that hung elegantly from her slender frame. At the sight of Miss Marple, her eyes brightened with relief. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank heavens, I didn't know who else to speak to." Miss Marple approached with warmth. "My dear Mrs. Whitfield, I am deeply sorry to hear you have suffered a loss this morning. I do hope it is something that can be resolved quickly." Mrs. Whitfield dabbed her eyes. "I fear not. It's Henry's ledger, his winter ledger. Every year he kept one. He considered it a private reflection of business matters, personal accounts, and things he believed only he should manage." Miss Marple sat gently opposite her. "I imagine the book carries sentimental value." "Sentimental, yes, but more than that. There were matters in there relating to the estate, and certain unresolved legal points concerning his family. If those pages were to fall into the wrong hands—" She stopped, trembling. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "Please do take your time." Mrs. Whitfield inhaled shakily. "I went to the study at 6 this morning. The ledger was gone. The window had frost on the inside, which was odd, and the lamp was still warm, as though someone had used the room only moments before." She swallowed. "But I had been asleep. I heard nothing." Miss Marple observed her closely. "And no signs of disturbance?" "None. But someone must have known exactly where Henry kept it. Only a handful of people ever visited the study. Only a handful knew the significance." Miss Marple asked softly, "May I see the study?" Mrs. Whitfield nodded at once. The two made their way down the dim corridor. The study door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the room was neat and orderly, mahogany shelves, heavy drapes, and a grand desk near the solitary window. But Miss Marple's eyes caught the small, telling things: a faint indentation in the rug near the bookshelf, a single chair slightly off-center, a brass lamp with a smudge on its base, and a small patch of clean floor where dust should have settled. Someone had stood there recently. Someone careful. Miss Marple moved slowly, eyes sweeping the room with the grace of someone who had done this many times, though always under the guise of a polite, elderly lady with a fondness for observation. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said kindly, Was anyone aware of your luncheon preparations? Anyone who might have wished to walk through the house under the excuse of helping? The widow hesitated. Well, yes. Several people came by yesterday. Ah? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Who precisely? Mrs. Whitfield listed them. Mr. Denwood, the caretaker of Winterbrook Lodge, helpful but nosy. Miss Clara Hensley, the village's most enthusiastic volunteer, desperate to befriend Mrs. Whitfield. Colonel Burton, a family acquaintance from London, arrived unexpectedly. Lydia Marsh, the seamstress, bringing table linens. And each had reason, Mrs. Whitfield sighed heavily, to step into the study at some point. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, I imagine they did. Her gaze drifted once more to the window. The frost inside suggested the window had been opened and closed recently. Perhaps someone had slipped in during the earliest dawn, or slipped out. Either possibility was intriguing. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Whitfield with a calm, comforting expression. My dear, I believe your luncheon must indeed be postponed for today. Something more pressing requires attention. Mrs. Whitfield looked stricken. Do you think it can be solved? Miss Marple patted her gently on the hand. My experience tells me that even the smallest detail, something most people overlook, is often the key to the entire matter. She stood, and I have already seen quite a few small details. Outside, the snow continued falling in quiet, deceptive peace. Inside Frost Hollow Manor, an invisible tension lingered, and Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and comforting presence, had just stepped into a mystery that would soon reveal far more than a missing ledger. It would reveal a betrayal. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Winter Sky. By midday, the snowfall had eased into a light flurry, drifting gently across St. Mary Mead like feathers shaken from an unseen pillow. The village, normally lively even on brisk mornings, was oddly subdued. People walked quietly, huddled in their scarves, their expressions tight with curiosity. News, especially news involving Frost Hollow Manor, traveled swiftly, regardless of discretion. Miss Marple, having returned from the manor earlier with her usual delicate step, found herself now strolling toward the high street. She carried her shopping basket, though she had little intention of buying anything. It simply allowed her to appear as any other village resident running a few errands. But her mind was engaged in something altogether different. The missing ledger, the frost inside the window, the warm lamp, the open gate, the multiple visitors from the day before, little inconsistencies that fluttered about like snowflakes, waiting to settle into a pattern. She knew from experience that the key to understanding a mystery was not always found at the scene itself, but in the people connected to it, and St. Mary Mead had never been short of interesting people. The first person Miss Marple intended to see was Miss Clara Hensley, the over-eager volunteer who could be found most mornings at the church hall even when nothing required her presence. Clara Hensley had a habit of inserting herself into situations that needed no insertion at all, and she had made a great show lately of assisting Mrs. Whitfield, though others whispered she was more interested in attaching herself to Frost Hollow's social status than in any charitable activities. As Miss Marple approached the churchyard, she spotted Clara sweeping stray leaves off the stone steps with unnecessary zeal. "My dear Miss Hensley," Miss Marple called gently. Clara turned, her pink cheeks glowing from exertion or excitement. It was always hard to tell which. "Miss Marple, oh my goodness, have you heard? Dreadful business at Frost Hollow. I've been worried sick, absolutely sick. Poor Mrs. Whitfield must be in pieces." Miss Marple smiled sympathetically. "She is indeed shaken, quite understandably. I had hoped you might help me understand her state the day before. After all, I believe you were among those assisting her." Clara's eyes lit with pride. "Why, yes. Mrs. Whitfield asked me to help choose floral arrangements for the luncheon table. She said I had impeccable taste. She touched her chest dramatically. How thoughtful of her. Miss Marple leaned forward as though simply indulging in conversation. Did you happen to go into the study at any point? The study? Oh, well, yes. Clara blushed and adjusted her scarf. Only briefly. I needed to fetch her approval on some invitations, and she said the envelopes were on the writing desk. But I hardly touched a thing. Of course, it must have been a swift visit. Oh, certainly. I'm very respectful of people's private spaces. Miss Marple nodded, though she noticed Clara's swift, darting glance, an unmistakable sign of withheld information. Did you notice anything amiss? She asked gently. Anything out of place? Clara hesitated. Well, no, not at first, but when I left the room I did hear a sound from the hallway. Perhaps someone walking quickly or closing a door. I didn't think much of it. And you didn't see who it was? No, I was already halfway down the stairs. Clara's broom paused mid-sweep as she leaned closer. Miss Marple, do you suppose someone might have taken something from the study? Mrs. Dunn hinted as much, and Mrs. Dunn never hints unless it's terribly serious. Miss Marple gave a mild, non-committal smile. I believe it's best not to jump to conclusions. Clara nodded, though her expression suggested she had already leapt to several conclusions. Miss Marple left her to her sweeping and continued toward the high street. Her next stop was Lydia Marsh, the village seamstress, a quiet young woman with nimble fingers and a cautious demeanor. Lydia rarely engaged in gossip. She was known for her respectful silence and her talent for fine stitching, and therefore she was often privy to people's private matters, though she spoke little of them. Her shop, tucked between the bakery and the grocer, smelled faintly of lavender and clean cotton. Lydia looked up from her sewing machine as Miss Marple entered. Good afternoon, Miss Marple, she said with a soft smile. What brings you by in this weather? Oh, merely a bit of curiosity, Miss Marple said pleasantly. And perhaps a desire for a warm room and friendly company? Lydia chuckled gently. You're always welcome. She set aside a half-finished table runner embroidered with holly leaves. Miss Marple took a seat on the cushioned stool near the counter. My dear, I understand you were assisting Mrs. Whitfield yesterday. Delivering linens, was it? Yes. She had requested fresh runners and napkins for the luncheon. Mrs. Dunn met me at the door, but Mrs. Whitfield insisted I show her the designs in the study where she kept her color swatches. How thoughtful. Miss Marple watched Lydia's hands, steady, unflustered, entirely unlike Clara Hensley's fidgety manner. Did you notice anything out of place at the time? Lydia paused thoughtfully. Nothing obvious. The room was neat, but Mrs. Whitfield did seem tense, distracted, as though she was thinking of something else. Tense? Miss Marple repeated mildly. Yes. When I asked about the luncheon, she barely responded. She mentioned she'd received a letter that troubled her, though she didn't elaborate. A letter? Miss Marple's brows lifted subtly. Yes, a thick envelope. She tucked it into the drawer of her writing desk as soon as I entered. It seemed private. How interesting. Miss Marple lowered her gaze thoughtfully. Did you see the handwriting? Lydia shook her head. I only glimpsed the corner, but the paper looked expensive. Cream linen, I think. Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly on her basket. A mysterious letter arriving the day before the ledger vanished. That was certainly something. Thank you, my dear, she said with a warm smile. You have been most helpful. Lydia, who never overestimated her importance, simply blushed and returned to her sewing as Miss Marple departed. Outside, the air was colder. The flurries had returned, swirling gently around her boots. As she made her way along the high street, she noticed Colonel Burton striding out of the grocer's with a large sack of coal tucked under his arm. He was a stout, weathered man in his early 60s with a thick mustache and brisk manner. "Miss Marple," he boomed in his resonant voice. "Good heavens, what are you doing out in this frost? You'll catch pneumonia." "I assure you I am quite hardy," Miss Marple said with a polite nod. "And you, Colonel? I imagine your visit to the grocer was essential." "Indeed. The blasted servants at the house I'm lodging in can't tell the difference between half-full and empty coal bins." He harumphed. "So one must fend for oneself." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I understand you visited Mrs. Whitfield yesterday. A kind gesture." "Yes, well, old family connection. Thought I'd pay my respects and see how she was faring in that great big house alone." He paused, shifting his sack of coal. "Though I must admit she looked pale, preoccupied. Wouldn't tell me what was bothering her." "So others observed," Miss Marple said softly. "Did she mention receiving a letter?" The Colonel frowned. "Letter? No. She excused herself for a moment during my visit, went off to the study, took longer than she ought to. When she returned, she seemed flustered." "Did you go into the study?" "Certainly not. Wouldn't dream of it." But as Miss Marple watched him, she noticed a slight twitch of discomfort in his expression, barely noticeable but present nonetheless. "Well," she said warmly, "thank you for speaking with me." He gave a curt nod. "If you're headed home, may I offer to escort you?" "Oh, thank you, Colonel, but I have a few more errands." She waved politely as he trudged off, snow crunching beneath his heavy boots. There was one more person Miss Marple wished to visit before returning home. Mr. Denwood, the caretaker of Winterbrook Lodge. Denwood was a peculiar man, helpful to a fault, always appearing at the exact moment when assistance was needed, or sometimes when it was not needed at all. His curiosity was almost comical, though his intentions were rarely malicious. He enjoyed knowing things. Too much, some said. Winterbrook Lodge was only a short walk from the village center, though a quieter path led toward it. When Miss Marple arrived, she found Mr. Denwood kneeling by the side gate, battling a stubborn latch with a screwdriver. "Good afternoon, Mr. Denwood," Miss Marple said. He flinched slightly before turning. "Miss Marple, you startled me. Blasted latch won't hold with this cold, everything's freezing up." "It has been a harsh morning." She approached, her hands clasped calmly. "I understand you visited Mrs. Whitfield yesterday?" Mr. Denwood's brows shot up. "News travels fast in this village. Yes, I stopped by. Routine business, you know, checking on the state of her garden pipes. Frost can be cruel to them. I imagine she appreciated your help." "Oh, she did. We inspected the pipes, the shed, the back gate, the boiler room. All sorts of things." He wiped his forehead dramatically, though the weather hardly called for it. "And did your inspection bring you near the study?" "The study?" His voice cracked slightly. "Oh, no. No, not at all. That's inside business. I stick to the outside." Miss Marple watched him closely. "I see. Did you notice anything unusual around the manor grounds?" "Unusual?" He paused, thinking. "Well, now that you mention it, yes, the back gate was unlocked. Mrs. Whitfield always keeps it locked, always." "Very curious," Miss Marple said softly. "Did you mention it to her?" "I did. She brushed it off, said she must have forgotten. But I've never known her to forget." Miss Marple nodded slowly. A back gate unlocked, a front gate wide open at dawn, a missing ledger, a mysterious letter, visitors entering the study, too many details to be coincidence. "Well, Mr. Denwood," she said warmly, "thank you for your time. I shall leave you to your repairs." He tipped his cap, though his eyes darted away uneasily, as though her questions had unsettled him more than he wished to admit. Miss Marple began her walk home, her steps measured and thoughtful. 4 visitors, 4 possible suspects. Clara too eager to impress and too nervous to hide her uncertainty. Lydia, quiet but observant and aware of a mysterious letter. Colonel Burton, old family acquaintance, unexpectedly arrived. Mr. Denwood, with access to the grounds and a tendency to see more than he should. And behind it all, something troubled Mrs. Whitfield yesterday, before the ledger vanished. Upon reaching her cottage, Miss Marple removed her shawl, set aside her basket, and sat near the fire once more. The warmth seeped into her hands as she reflected on the day's conversations. 4 suspects. But which of them had motive, and what exactly did the missing ledger contain that made it worth stealing? Above all, Miss Marple sensed something deeper, an emotional undercurrent in Mrs. Whitfield's expression, a silent fear not merely of the missing book but of the implications it carried. The sun dipped behind the snowy rooftops of St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village. A mystery had settled over the winter landscape, and Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle intuition, felt certain the missing ledger was merely the beginning. Chapter 3. Whispers Beneath the Lamplight. The next morning dawned, pale and muted, as though the snowfall itself had hushed the world into cautious silence. The church bells tolled softly across St. Mary Mead, drifting over white rooftops and chimneys, breathing faint spirals of smoke. Miss Marple, wrapped in her thick wool coat, stepped carefully along the frosted path leading toward the village green. Her cheeks were pink from the biting air, but her eyes glinted with the quiet, determined warmth that always accompanied the beginning of a new puzzle. News of the sabotaged lockbox had spread more swiftly than the snowstorm, traveling from hearth to hearth on the wings of eager gossip. Villagers stood in small clusters beneath the lamplights, muttering theories and half-formed suspicions. Miss Marple paused briefly outside the post office, where Mrs. Hartley Billings, in a fur-trimmed hat far too elegant for the countryside, held court before a trio of equally enthusiastic listeners. "I'm certain it was an outsider," Mrs. Hartley Billings declared, her voice edged in dramatic urgency. "Some traveler passing through. These things always come from outside influences, never from well-bred villagers." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Ah, but dear Mrs. Hartley Billings, one must remember that trouble, like ivy, often grows closest to its own wall." The lady harumphed, adjusting her gloves in a flustered flutter. The listeners exchanged curious glances, but Miss Marple continued her stroll without further comment. She had no desire to correct or confront. She merely observed, as was her habit. Observation, after all, was the first step toward truth. Her destination was the village hall, where the Women's Guild had gathered in tense disarray. Tables usually crowded with fabric scraps and teapots now held only abandoned knitting needles and half-completed decorations for the fete. The committee members hovered in clusters, faces drawn with worry. At the center of the room stood Evelyn Pierce, the guild treasurer and the woman responsible for safeguarding the stolen contributions. Evelyn's normally composed demeanor was frayed, her eyes shadowed by a sleepless night. Her fingers twisted the hem of her cardigan as she attempted to reassure the women around her, though her voice betrayed her strain. "I simply cannot understand it," she said, her tone quivering. "I locked the box myself, checked it twice. Everything was in order before the storm." Miss Marple moved closer, offering a gentle nod. "And no one else had a key?" Evelyn hesitated. "Only Mr. Fletcher," she said finally. "He's chairman of the fete committee, but he wasn't even in the village last night." Miss Marple tucked that detail away like a neatly stitched thread waiting for its place in the larger pattern. "A terrible ordeal, my dear. But perhaps you can tell me, did anything seem unusual yesterday? Anything at all?" Evelyn pressed a trembling hand to her temple. "Well, there was a disagreement. Mr. Fletcher was quite cross about the budget. He insisted that the floral arrangements were a waste of funds. Her voice softened. But he wouldn't steal. He's stubborn, yes, but honest. Not entirely convinced, Miss Marple thanked her and moved on. The hall had its own stories to tell. She paused where the lockbox had been placed the previous evening, a polished oak table near the curtained window. Even in its absence, the space seemed charged with restless energy, as though the room remembered the injustice committed within its walls. A faint smell lingered near the window, a curious mingling of damp wool and something metallic. Miss Marple leaned closer. A single snowflake melted upon the sill, leaving behind a glistening droplet. Someone had opened the window recently. But who? And why, in the middle of a snowstorm? She retraced the steps a thief might have taken. The curtains, thick and heavy, parted just enough for a slim figure to slip through unnoticed. The footprints outside would have been erased quickly by the falling snow. Clever or fortunate, in either case it meant intention. Miss Marple stood for several quiet moments, letting the room settle around her. The clatter of hushed voices in the background faded into a soft, indistinct hum as she pieced together the fragments of information. Evelyn distraught, Fletcher angry. The window disturbed. Snowmelt on the sill. Someone comfortable with entering unnoticed and leaving without a trace. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden loud bang as the hall door swung open. In strode Clara Whitford, cheeks flushed, boots dusted with fresh snow and expression tense. Clara was known for her fiery temper and sharp tongue, qualities that both intimidated and amused the village in equal measure. "I suppose everyone's blaming me already," Clara snapped, removing her gloves with jerky movements. "Because heaven forbid anything goes wrong without people pointing fingers at the young widow." Evelyn stepped forward in alarm. "Clara, no one—" "Oh, don't bother sugarcoating it," Clara cut in. "I know how this village works, and for the record, I haven't the faintest interest in the fate funds, nor time for such nonsense." Miss Marple's gaze softened as Clara's voice cracked slightly at the last word. Beneath her fiery exterior, the woman was exhausted, carrying burdens no one else cared to see. "Clara, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe no one here wishes to accuse you unjustly. But perhaps you might share where you were last night. The weather was dreadful. One hopes you were somewhere warm." The hall fell into a hush. Clara glared at the collection of curious eyes before drawing in a long breath. "I was at the station," she admitted, "waiting for a telegram from my solicitor, and before anyone asks, I didn't receive it." There was bitterness there, bitterness and fear. Miss Marple watched her with interest. Clara was hiding something, but not necessarily guilt. Secrets, after all, were currency in a village like St. Mary Mead, but they did not always purchase wrongdoing. Before Miss Marple could ask more, Mr. Pemberton, St. Mary Mead's postmaster, hobbled into the hall, his spectacles fogged with cold. He raised a sheet of paper in one hand. "Message from the inspector," he announced. "They'll be sending someone later today to look into the matter." A wave of nervous murmurs rippled across the hall. Miss Marple merely folded her hands. "Inspector or no inspector," she said softly, "this is a village matter. And villages, I find, often reveal their secrets to those who care to listen." The women exchanged uneasy glances, but something in Miss Marple's calm certainty soothed their fears. She had that effect, an air of quiet reliability like a warm lamp glowing in a wintry night. As the meeting dissolved into scattered conversations, Miss Marple stepped outside once more. The snow had begun again, soft flakes drifting silently like whispered confessions. She paused beneath the lamplight, watching the village breathe in all its quiet complexities. Someone among them had stolen the fate funds, Someone familiar with the hall, the window, the routines of the Women's Guild. Someone who believed they could act unseen. Chapter 4. Shadows Along the Green. The snow continued its gentle descent over St. Mary Mead, blanketing the village green in a pristine layer that sparkled faintly beneath the pale mid-morning sun. Miss Marple walked with careful steps, her sensible boots pressing neat imprints into the untouched white. She often found that a morning stroll cleared the mind, especially when a mystery threaded itself through everyday life like a snag in an old cardigan. The previous evening's events lay heavily on her thoughts. A stolen lockbox, a tampered window, 3 troubled suspects, and more questions than answers. Yet Miss Marple knew from decades of quiet observation that human nature, much like snow, reveals its patterns when one knows where to look. And today, she planned to look closely indeed. Her first stop was the vicarage, where Reverend Leonard Clement met her at the door with a weary smile. "Miss Marple, my dear, come in. You must be freezing." The warmth inside the sitting room wrapped around her like a comforting shawl. A small fire crackled, and the scent of cinnamon tea drifted invitingly. "Thank you, Reverend," she replied as she settled into her usual chair. "I thought it best to discuss the matter of the fate funds. The village is in quite a state." "Yes, quite," he sighed, rubbing his temples. "I've been fielding calls since dawn. The inspector arrives this afternoon. Though between us, I suspect they'll be more baffled than helpful. Snow hides far too many sins." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Indeed. But snow also reveals footsteps, for instance." The Reverend blinked. "Oh, footsteps? Did you see?" No, she interrupted gently. "Not yet. But I expect there were traces before the storm covered them. Someone entered the hall last night by the window. That requires opportunity, and opportunity reveals habit." He considered this thoughtfully. "Do you believe it was someone local?" "Oh, I'm quite certain," she said softly. "The window latch is tricky. Only someone familiar with the hall would know how to finesse it quietly." The Reverend leaned forward. "And who might that be?" Miss Marple folded her hands primly. "That is precisely what I intend to learn." After their brief discussion, she thanked him and ventured back into the cold. Her next destination lay at the far end of the green, Mr. Fletcher's cottage. Arthur Fletcher was not an unkind man, but he held the sort of rigidity that made him both respected and quietly resented. Miss Marple found the gate half open, the snow inside stamped by heavy boots walking back and forth in anxious circles. Arthur answered the door with a sharp exhale. "Miss Marple, if you've come to accuse me, I assure you—" "My dear Arthur," she said pleasantly, "I've come to do no such thing. But I would appreciate a few words if you're willing to indulge an old lady." He stepped aside, begrudgingly courteous. The cottage interior was surprisingly tidy, though the fireplace remained unlit, casting the room in a chilly gloom. Arthur perched stiffly on the edge of his armchair. "I assume this is about the money," he muttered. "Quite so. Evelyn Pierce mentioned you disagreed about the fate expenses." His jaw tightened. "I did. But good heavens, woman, disagreeing isn't a crime." "Of course not," she replied, her tone light. "But financial disputes often grow roots in unexpected soil. You were away during the storm, I believe?" "At my sister's," he said quickly, "in Much Benham. Ask her if you like." "I shall, no doubt," she murmured. His alibi was plausible, yet his nervous fidgeting suggested more lay beneath the surface. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to sweep the room. A scarf lay drying near the stove, its edges dusted with melted snow. Curious. If he had returned early from Much Benham. But she would not press him. Not yet. Outside once more, Miss Marple turned toward her final stop of the morning, the edge of Gable Lane, where Clara Whitford lived in a modest cottage tucked between two towering fir trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Clara herself stood at the door, arms crossed, expression guarded. "Oh, it's you," Clara said flatly. Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Good morning, my dear. I hoped we might chat a bit more." Clara hesitated before stepping aside. The interior was bright, filled with handmade quilts draped along the walls. Clara's late husband had been fond of warmth, she'd once said. Yet the coziness could not mask the tension in Clara's shoulders. "Look," Clara began abruptly, "if this is about the fate money—" "It is," Miss Marple said gently, "but I assure you my interest lies in the truth, not in accusations." Clara sighed, dropping heavily into a chair. "People already assume I'm trouble. A woman alone always is." "Not to those who look carefully," Miss Marple replied. "You said yesterday you were waiting at the station for a telegram. Might I ask, was anyone else there?" Clara hesitated. Her fingers drummed a restless pattern on the armrest. "Just Mr. Pemberton. He locked up early because of the storm. He saw me. But the telegram never came." Miss Marple nodded, observing her closely. Clara's frustration seemed genuine, but beneath it lingered a weariness that spoke of deeper troubles. Something far older than yesterday's theft. "You seemed quite upset at the meeting," Miss Marple noted softly. Clara laughed without humor. "Everyone watches me, always. They think I'm reckless because I speak my mind. But I've done nothing wrong." "On that," Miss Marple replied, "I happen to agree." Clara blinked in surprise but said nothing more. Miss Marple stepped back into the snow, her mind alive with connections and inconsistencies. Clara's agitation, Arthur's hidden scarf, Evelyn's trembling confusion, each piece hinted at hidden truths, but none yet formed the complete picture. She paused near the village green once more, her breath misting in the frosty air. The snow was falling harder now, cloaking the cottages and lampposts in a dreamy hush. Yet beneath that peaceful white, the village simmered with secrets. As she turned to walk home, a sudden glimmer near the hall caught her attention. A tiny object peeking from beneath the snowdrift just outside the window. Miss Marple crouched with surprising agility and brushed the snow aside. There, half buried, lay a small brass button, smooth, polished, and distinctive. Not from Evelyn's cardigan, not from the vicar's coat. No. She recognized it at once, a button from Arthur Fletcher's overcoat. Her eyebrows lifted, though her expression remained composed. Snow, indeed, revealed, and now the shadow stretching across the village green had taken on a far more intriguing shape. Chapter 5. The Button by the Window. Miss Marple carried the brass button delicately between her gloved fingers as she walked back toward her cozy cottage. The snow had softened again into a fine, whispering powder that coated everything in a gentle white hush. Yet inside her mind, patterns clicked and shifted with sharp precision. A button, seemingly insignificant yet telling. She had learned long ago that objects lost in the wrong place spoke louder than confessions. Once home, she slipped into her warm sitting room, set a kettle to boil, and placed the button on a small lace doily beside her. The snowlight through the window gave it a soft golden glow. Miss Marple observed it, thoughtfully. Arthur Fletcher's overcoat, yes, she recalled the distinctive brass buttons well. She had noticed them during last month's church luncheon, gleaming proudly on his otherwise worn coat like stubborn badges of propriety. But a button alone did not prove guilt. Buttons fell off, buttons snagged, buttons wandered. She knew better than to leap to conclusions, unlike many in the village who eagerly did so at every whisper of scandal. After her tea, Miss Marple wrapped herself warmly once more and headed out to gather more information. Her first destination was the small cobblestone workshop of Mr. Whitaker, the village tailor, who noticed everything about everyone's clothing, often more than they wished he did. Inside, the workshop was fragrant with wool, cedar, and chalk dust. Mr. Whitaker sat hunched over a garment, silver needles glinting between swift fingers. He looked up sharply when Miss Marple entered. "Ah, Miss Marple. Cold morning, isn't it? How may I assist you?" She placed the brass button gently on the counter. "I wondered if you might recognize this." He lifted it, inspecting it with a familiar intensity. Brass, polished, slightly flattened along one edge. "Yes, from Arthur Fletcher's coat. I replaced 2 of them for him last winter." "Only 2?" she asked mildly. "Yes, the others were fastened firmly. Arthur's quite particular about appearances." That, Miss Marple thought, told her a great deal. "Has he brought the coat for repairs since?" she asked. Mr. Whitaker shook his head. "Not in recent months, though I did notice him tugging at the bottom hem last week when he came to collect Mrs. Pierce's mended gloves. The coat's a bit tight on him these days. Might have strained a seam." Strained seams meant loose buttons. Loose buttons meant possibilities. Yet one detail lingered. Arthur had been using the coat yesterday despite claiming he spent the stormy evening away. If he had returned earlier than he said, and if that button had indeed fallen outside the village hall window. Miss Marple thanked the tailor and stepped back into the falling snow, pondering the possibilities. Her next call was to Evelyn Pierce. The young treasurer answered her door with a pale face and red-rimmed eyes. She looked as though the night had given her no rest at all. "Oh, Miss Marple, has anything new been discovered?" "Nothing conclusive yet," Miss Marple replied gently. "But I thought perhaps you could clarify something about the lockbox. Who usually counts the fate funds besides you?" Evelyn hesitated. "Well, Arthur sometimes insists on reviewing the totals. He says it's necessary to avoid mistakes." Her voice steadied. "But I never allow him to be alone with the lockbox, not after—" She abruptly stopped. "After what, dear?" Miss Marple asked softly. Evelyn's eyes darted aside. "It's nothing. Only a minor disagreement." Miss Marple smiled kindly, but said nothing. She had learned, with Evelyn especially, that silence often coaxed more truth than questions. After a moment, Evelyn folded. "Arthur accused me once of misplacing £1, but I hadn't. He was mistaken. He apologized, but I never forgot." Miss Marple's heart softened. Poor Evelyn, so earnest, so easily shaken by mistrust. She left the Pierce cottage with more threads to untangle and headed next toward the post office. Mr. Pemberton stood behind the counter, sorting letters with slow precision. He brightened when he saw her. "Miss Marple, terrible business, this theft. Clara Whitford was at the station last night, by the way, if that's of interest. Worried half to death, she was." "Yes, she mentioned as much," Miss Marple replied. "No one else passed through?" "Not after 7. Storm came down fierce. Anyone out after that would be a fool." Miss Marple nodded. Clara's story held firm. Arthur's alibi, however, remained troublingly thin. As she stepped outside, the snow had thickened. Villagers hurried along the paths, their coats pulled tight, their faces shadowed with curiosity and worry. Rumors thrived in such weather. Secrets grew behind frosted windows. Miss Marple returned to the village hall. She stood beneath the window where she had found the button and studied the area again. The storm had freshened the snow, but near the window's base the faintest indentation remained. Recent, shallow, and shaped like the edge of a boot heel. Footsteps erased quickly in snow, but not all traces vanished. She touched the chilly pane. The latch inside showed a faint scrape, as if someone unfamiliar with its stiff mechanism had struggled to open or close it quietly. someone unfamiliar, or someone in a hurry. Snowflakes drifted into her hair as she stood lost in thought. Arthur Fletcher did not strike her as impulsive. Rigid, yes, proud, certainly. But hasty? No. His movements were always controlled. But someone tugging at a tight coat, pulling hard against seams, might wrench a button loose without noticing. Especially in the dark, especially in a moment of tension. Yet something still felt wrong. Arthur was stubborn, not cunning. If he had planned theft, he would not have left behind evidence as obvious as a button. Unless the button had been planted. Miss Marple felt a spark of clarity flicker in her chest. Sabotage came in many forms and betrayal wore many faces. Chapter 6. Secrets Beneath the Snow. The morning broke over St. Mary Mead with a faint pink glow on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-laden cottages. Miss Marple pulled her coat tightly around her shoulders, the chill seeping into her bones but sharpening her senses. Today, she decided, would be a day of careful observation, for it was not the snow itself that held answers, but the small movements of the villagers as they negotiated its frozen grip. Her first stop was the manor, for Mrs. Whitfield had requested her presence. As she approached Frost Hollow, she noticed the front gate slightly ajar once again, a thin trail of snow-marked footprints leading inward. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed subtly. Someone had entered or left the grounds in the night, likely after her own discovery of Arthur Fletcher's button. That detail would need careful consideration. Inside, the house felt unusually quiet. The heavy curtains were drawn against the frost, and the faint scent of simmering stew filled the air. Mrs. Whitfield sat near the fire, her hands tightly clasped around a teacup, her eyes shadowed with concern. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said softly. "I hardly slept. The whole affair is beyond me. I cannot fathom who would do such a thing or why." Miss Marple offered a comforting smile. "I understand, my dear, but I think we may be closer to understanding than you realize. Tell me, did you notice anyone acting unusually yesterday beyond the obvious visitors?" Mrs. Whitfield hesitated. "Well, Lydia Marsh seemed nervous, though I could not understand why, and Clara Whitford kept glancing toward the study almost as though expecting something, but it was Arthur. Oh, Arthur. I cannot reconcile his presence with the button found outside the hall." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Sometimes appearances are misleading, Mrs. Whitfield. A planted clue, or even an accidental one, can shift suspicion in curious ways." The lady sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I only wish I understood. The ledger contained more than money. It had records of donations, promises, and some matters that I had thought forgotten. If someone took it, well, it could unravel much more than a fate." Miss Marple nodded. That hint of a deeper motive was significant. Many thefts were simple greed, but some were intertwined with pride, jealousy, or the desire to cover a past misdeed. After leaving Frost Hollow, Miss Marple decided to visit Lydia Marsh, the quiet seamstress who had previously noted the mysterious letter. Lydia's shop was bright and orderly, though her hands trembled slightly as she folded lengths of cloth. "Good morning, Lydia," Miss Marple began softly. "I wonder if you might help me with a small puzzle. Have you noticed anything unusual around the village hall or manor recently?" Lydia bit her lip. I'm not sure," she admitted. "It's just that, well, someone has been asking questions about the ledger before it disappeared. People I would not have expected." "People like whom?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "I only overheard voices," Lydia murmured, lowering her gaze. "But one night last week I saw Clara Whitford near the manor. She appeared unsettled, as though expecting to find something. I didn't speak to her, of course." Miss Marple made a note of this internally. Clara's agitation was persistent, though her story about being at the station remained consistent. Perhaps someone else had forced her hand, or perhaps she had been in two places at once in a moment of confusion. Either scenario warranted further scrutiny. Next, Miss Marple walked toward the village green, her mind returning to Arthur Fletcher. She considered the brass button and the footprints at the hall. She also recalled Mr. Denwood's earlier remarks about the back gate at Winterbrook Lodge, always unlocked during the storm, a rare oversight from a careful caretaker. Small details, she knew, often revealed the biggest truths. At Winterbrook Lodge, Denwood met her with an anxious expression. "Miss Marple, I trust the button was found?" he asked, fidgeting with the latch of the back gate. "Yes," she replied. "And you mentioned the gate was unlocked?" Denwood nodded vigorously. "Yes, always. I can't explain it. I check it twice a day, never forget. But last night, perhaps someone forced it. Careful, quiet. I wouldn't have heard." Miss Marple considered this. The combination of a tampered window, a loose button, and an unlocked gate suggested not only opportunity but planning. Someone had observed patterns closely, likely to avoid suspicion. "Tell me, Mr. Denwood," she asked with gentle curiosity, "who comes and goes frequently aside from the usual villagers?" "Well, there's Clara. She's out and about often. Lydia, though less. And of course Arthur visits Frost Hollow regularly." He frowned, scratching his head. "But I can't imagine anything sinister." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Sometimes, Mr. Denwood, mischief is far subtler than it seems. Quiet movements often conceal loud intentions." Leaving Winterbrook Lodge, Miss Marple paused by the edge of the village green. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the path, and the world seemed hushed and expectant. She thought carefully, connecting her threads of observation. The key moments were clear: the brass button outside the hall, footprints in the snow, Lydia's overheard observation of Clara near the manor, and Arthur's questionable alibi. Add to that the locked box and the sensitive ledger containing more than mere money. And a picture began to form, not yet complete, but startling in its outlines. Miss Marple noted the villagers passing by, unaware of the web being spun around them. They were all actors in a subtle drama, each with their routines, quirks, and hidden emotions. To unravel the mystery, one had to follow both the threads of human behavior and the tangible clues left behind. By afternoon, she returned to her cottage, the wind carrying soft flakes into the garden. She sat by her fire, the brass button gleaming faintly on the table beside her, and allowed her mind to work quietly through the possibilities. Clara's nervous energy, Lydia's observations, Denwood's admission about the gate, Arthur's inconsistency, each puzzle piece required careful placement, and yet she knew that when the picture fully emerged, it would reveal far more than just a petty theft. The betrayal hinted at something deeper, something that would touch not only the ledger but the trust and relationships at the heart of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple smiled gently to herself. The snow had a way of covering things temporarily, but not forever. Beneath its quiet, it preserved patterns and traces like an artist's faint sketch beneath a finished painting. All she needed was patience and the sharpest eyes in the village. Chapter 7. Clues in the Candlelight. That evening, St. Mary Mead was quiet. The snow had slowed to a delicate dusting, and the village streets shimmered under the soft glow of gas lamps. Windows glimmered with candlelight, reflecting the cozy domesticity that marked this corner of England. Yet Miss Marple knew that beneath this serene surface, secrets lingered like shadows at the edge of the room. She began her evening at Frost Hollow Manor, where Mrs. Whitfield had invited her for tea. The fire blazed in the hearth, casting golden light across the polished floors and the heavy curtains drawn against the encroaching dusk. Miss Marple noticed immediately that Mrs. Whitfield seemed slightly less tense than earlier, though her eyes still held a flicker of worry. "Miss Marple, I am grateful you've come," Mrs. Whitfield said softly. "The ledger, the thought of it being taken from under my nose still troubles me greatly." She placed her teacup down with a delicate clink, then rose to fetch the sugar bowl. "I cannot imagine who would wish to betray me or the village." Miss Marple offered a mild smile. "Sometimes, my dear, betrayal comes from the most unexpected quarters, and often the most ordinary people are capable of extraordinary cunning. But we shall see. Clues rarely hide forever." Mrs. Whitfield returned carrying the sugar and settled beside the fire. "Do you have any insight, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice small but curious. "I know you are a sharp observer." "I have noticed certain details," Miss Marple said carefully. "For instance, a brass button found near the hall's window. It does not belong to Mrs. Whitfield nor to her immediate staff. It is quite distinctive, in fact. Perhaps you can tell me who wears a coat with such buttons?" Mrs. Whitfield's eyebrows arched. "I believe that is Mr. Fletcher's coat. Arthur, of course, visits often, but I cannot imagine him." Her words faltered, and Miss Marple merely nodded. "Yes, sometimes appearances deceive," she said softly. "But the button, the footprints in the snow, and the unlocked gate together suggest someone with access and familiarity with the manor. Someone who knows the routines and the habits of those within." Mrs. Whitfield shivered slightly and wrapped her shawl closer. "I had hoped it was a simple mistake, but I am beginning to fear otherwise." After tea, Miss Marple excused herself, citing errands, but her mind remained alert. The snow had preserved delicate traces, and the evening shadows could reveal much if one looked carefully. Her next visit was to the village hall. She had arrived just as Mr. Denwood was closing the side gate, muttering about frozen hinges. "Good evening, Mr. Denwood," she said softly. "Might I ask you a few questions?" Denwood nodded, though he seemed slightly distracted by the cold. "Of course, Miss Marple, anything to help." Miss Marple gestured toward the hall. "The footprints from yesterday, did you notice anyone approaching the hall last night?" He hesitated. "Not directly, but I did see Clara Whitford pacing near the lane earlier. She looked upset, though I did not know why." Miss Marple inclined her head. Clara's presence near the hall at such a critical time was worth noting. "Did anyone else have reason to be nearby?" she asked. Denwood shrugged. "Only those who live close by. The snow keeps everyone indoors." Miss Marple thanked him and moved closer to the window, brushing away the slight frost on the pane. She could still make out faint imprints beneath the snow, the subtle lines of movement that betrayed a hurried entry and exit. Someone had been careful, yet left just enough evidence for a keen observer. Her thoughts returned to Clara. The young widow had shown genuine agitation, yet she had provided a seemingly airtight alibi for the evening's events. Could someone else have forced her hand, making her appear guilty or at least involved? Miss Marple considered that possibility with growing interest. As she walked back toward the high street, she noticed Lydia Marsh's lamp flickering through the frost-laden window. The seamstress was clearly working late. Miss Marple paused outside, tapping lightly on the glass. Lydia looked up, startled but relieved to see her. "Good evening, Lydia," Miss Marple said kindly. "May I come in for a moment?" "Of course, Miss Marple," Lydia replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "I was just finishing some embroidery for the vicarage. Please come in." The warmth enveloped Miss Marple instantly. The soft candlelight revealed Lydia's anxious expression more clearly than words ever could. "I've been thinking about the evening of the theft," Miss Marple began. "You mentioned seeing Clara near the manor. Did you notice anyone else?" Lydia shook her head. "No, only her. She seemed Afraid, I think, but not of anything I could see. Miss Marple nodded, studying her carefully. Fear can be a signal. Sometimes those who seem most guilty are merely witnesses or pawns. Lydia's eyes widened slightly. Do you think someone is trying to frame her? Possibly, Miss Marple said softly. But one must observe all details. Even the smallest clue, the sound of footsteps, the placement of a button, the movement of a gate, can reveal the truth. The two women spoke for a while longer, considering the possibilities. Miss Marple's sharp mind weighed the evidence. The brass button, the footprints, the unlocked gate, Clara's nervous presence, Lydia's testimony. Each detail built upon the other, forming a subtle but compelling pattern. By the time she stepped back into the snowy streets, Miss Marple's thoughts had crystallized. The true culprit was likely someone with access, knowledge, and motive, but also someone clever enough to mislead others with carefully planted hints. The key, she decided, would be watching how each suspect responded under pressure, and noticing which stories contained cracks when confronted with small, unexpected details. The night air was biting, but Miss Marple felt a spark of excitement. The investigation was at a turning point. The shadows along the green held secrets, yes, but they were beginning to outline a shape, one she could recognize. The final pieces would soon be revealed, and the betrayal under the snowy calm of St. Mary Mead would come to light. For now, she returned to her cottage, the fire waiting, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The village was a puzzle, the threads were tangled, and the snow covered many secrets. But Miss Marple knew how to follow the threads. Tomorrow she would act, and the truth, carefully gathered, would begin to emerge. Chapter 8. The Hidden Ledger. The morning sun glinted faintly across St. Mary Mead, turning the snow into a landscape of sparkling diamonds. Miss Marple wrapped herself in her thickest scarf and stepped into the crisp air, her mind already spinning with the threads of her investigation. The brass button, the unlocked gate, Clara's anxious movements, Lydia's observations, and Arthur Fletcher's questionable alibi, all of it formed a tapestry that demanded careful scrutiny. Today she would pull at one particularly frayed thread, the missing ledger itself. Her first stop was the village hall. Though the snow had softened into a slushy carpet beneath the doors, the hall's interior retained an uneasy stillness. The tables were cleared, yet the shadows of the previous evening's turmoil lingered in the corners. Evelyn Pierce met her with a relieved, though slightly anxious smile. "Miss Marple, I was hoping you'd come," she said softly. "I still can't believe it. Everything vanished so quickly." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her eyes drifting to the empty table where the lockbox had rested. "And yet, Evelyn, sometimes things are not entirely gone. Items like these often reveal themselves to those who look with care." Evelyn tilted her head, curiosity overcoming her worry. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple tapped her chin thoughtfully. "I suspect that whoever took the ledger left clues. They might have believed it irretrievable, yet in their haste or arrogance they left traces. Tell me, were any doors besides the window disturbed?" Evelyn frowned. "No, only the window. But the cupboard beneath the sideboard? I didn't check it this morning. It was always locked, though, except the caretaker sometimes leaves it slightly ajar." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Perhaps it would be worth a closer look. Together they approached the cupboard. Miss Marple crouched, examining the lock and hinges with practiced care. The wood bore faint scratches, subtle and precise, as though something had been moved in a hurry. She opened the cupboard to find it empty, yet her fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper, almost invisible in the dim light. She carefully retrieved it. "It's a note," she said softly, unfolding it. The handwriting was elegant, familiar, yet slightly rushed. Meet me at Winterbrook Lodge tonight. All will be explained. Evelyn gasped. But that's impossible. Who would... Miss Marple fingered the note. Someone confident. Someone who knows the manor, the hall, and the habits of its residents, and someone who wishes to communicate secretly. The clue led Miss Marple immediately to Winterbrook Lodge, where she arrived just before dusk. The gate, as Mr. Denwood had admitted, was unlocked, though tonight it creaked ominously in the wind. She stepped carefully along the path, her eyes catching subtle impressions in the snow. Footprints, distinct from any she had seen before, led toward a small side entrance. Inside the lodge, the shadows stretched long and the air smelled faintly of pine and wood polish. Miss Marple moved silently, each step measured until she found herself in the study. There, tucked beneath a loose floorboard, was a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. She lifted it gently and felt the familiar weight of the missing ledger. Relief and satisfaction mingled in her chest. She carried the ledger to the fire and laid it open, checking that all entries were intact. Indeed, everything remained untouched, though one page had a marginal note in hurried handwriting. Trust no one outside the circle. Watch the button. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. That reference, she realized, was deliberate. The brass button previously discovered outside the hall was more than a clue. It was a distraction. Someone had counted on the village's natural tendency to suspect Arthur Fletcher, but in reality the note pointed elsewhere. She returned the ledger carefully to its wrapping and moved to the window. Outside, the snow glistened, almost taunting in its pristine beauty. Miss Marple considered the suspects: Clara's agitation, Lydia's observation, Evelyn's innocence, and Arthur's apparent rigidness. Yet the note suggested premeditation by someone who knew how to manipulate appearances and expectations. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She turned to see Clara Whitford, cheeks flushed from the cold, standing uncertainly in the doorway. "Miss Marple, Clara began, but her voice faltered. "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "I believe I have found something that explains much." Clara stepped inside, eyes wide, as Miss Marple revealed the ledger and the note. "You found it?" she whispered. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And the note explains the clever misdirection. The brass button, the disturbed window, all orchestrated to point suspicion at Arthur Fletcher. But the true instigator is someone more subtle, who hoped the village would be misled." Clara's expression softened. "I knew something was off. I didn't understand it fully, but I felt pressured, like I was being watched." Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. And that pressure was intentional. Someone sought to frame or manipulate certain villagers, relying on their predictable reactions to snow, rumors, and appearances. Together they reviewed the ledger. Every entry aligned with the events Miss Marple had observed, yet subtle differences confirmed that the theft had been staged rather than opportunistic. The clues, the button, the window, Lydia's observation of Clara near the manor, and even Evelyn's minor anxieties were carefully calculated distractions. "Do you know who might have orchestrated this?" Clara asked quietly, leaning closer. Miss Marple paused, her mind racing through the chain of observations. "I have my suspicions," she said slowly. "The final proof will come from observing behavior under pressure. When confronted with a small, unexpected detail, the guilty party often reveals more than they intend." She set the ledger aside and gazed out the window at the falling snow. The village remained serene, a picture of quiet order. Yet beneath it, subtle tensions rippled. The plan of the instigator had relied on those tensions remaining hidden, on villagers assuming the obvious suspect was guilty. "But tomorrow," Miss Marple continued, her voice quiet but firm, "the final pieces will fall into place. The circle of observation is almost complete and the truth will emerge." The betrayal under the snowy blanket of St. Mary Mead will no longer remain hidden. Clara nodded slowly, hope mingled with apprehension in her eyes. She sensed the end of the mystery was near and that Miss Marple's patient, careful scrutiny would uncover what had been concealed. As the night deepened and the snow settled silently around Winterbrook Lodge, Miss Marple felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The hidden ledger had revealed the intentional misdirection, confirming her suspicions that the brass button and other signs were clever ruses. Now all that remained was to watch, wait, and see how the true culprit would respond when confronted with their own carefully orchestrated evidence. Miss Marple settled by the fire, the ledger in hand, her thoughts already on the confrontation that would soon reveal the identity of the person behind the betrayal. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept under its snowy quilt, blissfully unaware that the final act of revelation was at hand. Chapter 9. The Revelation at Frost Hollow. Following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a pale winter sun, reflecting off the snow, casting a soft, almost ethereal glow across the village. Miss Marple made her way deliberately toward Frost Hollow Manor, her steps careful yet purposeful. For today was the day when the threads she had been following would converge. The village, as always, seemed serene from the outside, cobblestones white with frost, smoke curling from chimneys. But Miss Marple knew that beneath this tranquil surface, the resolution of the theft and betrayal awaited. She arrived to find Mrs. Whitfield already in the drawing room, a fire crackling gently in the hearth. Evelyn Pierce was seated nearby, her hands nervously clasping a teacup. Clara Whitford and Arthur Fletcher had also been invited, each displaying a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Miss Marple greeted them all warmly, her calm presence immediately settling the tension in the room. "My dear friends," she began, "thank you for coming together. I believe that by reviewing the events carefully, we can uncover the truth behind the theft of the fate funds and the disturbances at the hall." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Arthur Fletcher shifted in his chair, clearing his throat. "I still protest that I am entirely innocent. This whole business has been most unfair." Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but firm. "I am aware, Arthur, and your innocence is not in question. However, appearances have been manipulated, and today we shall see how the pattern unfolds." She placed the brass button on the small table at the center of the room. "This was found outside the hall window," she said. "A clever misdirection designed to suggest that someone with access to the hall, someone like Arthur, might be responsible. Yet, as we have discovered, the ledger was moved with care and knowledge of the habits and schedules of several villagers." Clara Whitford leaned forward, frowning. "So, the button was meant to frame Arthur?" "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "But it is only one part of the picture. Let us consider the ledger itself." She unwrapped the small bundle, revealing the carefully folded pages. It was hidden at Winterbrook Lodge under a loose floorboard. Whoever took it wished to conceal both the theft and the message. A note instructing a secret meeting and warning to trust no one outside the circle. Evelyn gasped softly. "Someone planned this deliberately?" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. The movement of the ledger, the planted button, the disturbed window, these were calculated to divert attention. Yet every subtle detail observed carefully reveals a truth about the person behind the plan." She rose and moved to the window, glancing at the frosted garden beyond. "The key to discovering the culprit lies not only in the physical evidence but in observing reactions under pressure. The guilty party cannot help revealing themselves when confronted with facts that contradict their carefully constructed narrative." She turned to face the assembled villagers. "Now let us examine the recent events in sequence. The lockbox was secured. Evelyn counted the funds and Arthur was supposedly away. Yet we found a brass button from his coat outside the hall window, suggesting entry. Lydia Marsh observed Clara near the manor, appearing nervous. Mr. Denwood noted the unlocked gate at Winterbrook Lodge, and finally the ledger itself was hidden with an accompanying note, clearly intended for someone specific. Clara's eyes widened. So all of this, the button, the window, my presence, was staged? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, my dear. And the person who staged it relied upon the natural assumptions of the villagers to mislead us. She walked to the center of the room, her expression thoughtful yet resolute. Consider the evidence carefully. Who among us had the opportunity, the knowledge, and the motivation to execute such a plan? Arthur's jaw tightened. I had none of these. I protested yesterday, as you know. And rightly so, Miss Marple said kindly. Yet someone had to orchestrate this with subtlety and precision, someone familiar with both the hall and the manor, someone who could anticipate the reactions of those around them. The room fell silent. Even the crackling of the fire seemed subdued in anticipation. Then Miss Marple gestured gently toward Clara Whitford. Clara, I believe you sensed the pressure from someone else, the true instigator. And indeed, the individual relied upon your movements to further the deception. But you were unwitting in their design. Clara's eyes darted to Miss Marple. You mean I wasn't responsible? Not in the slightest, Miss Marple reassured her. The person behind this hoped you would appear guilty, though you were only in the wrong place at the wrong time. The true culprit was clever enough to anticipate your predictable nervousness. She turned her gaze toward Evelyn Pierce. And you, Evelyn, maintained integrity throughout, though the note and the ledger's disappearance were designed to sow doubt. Evelyn exhaled shakily. I never suspected. I was frightened. Understandably, Miss Marple said gently. But the final clue comes from the brass button, the slight scratches on the hall window, and the patterns of movement observed over the last days. They all point toward a single, meticulous planner. All eyes now turn toward the remaining figure. Lydia Marsh, the quiet seamstress. Her face blanched as Miss Marple continued. The guilty party, Miss Marple said softly, is someone who desired control over the funds and also wished to create confusion among the villagers. Their actions relied upon subtle misdirection, careful timing, and manipulation of appearances. Lydia's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Lydia, Miss Marple said firmly, but kindly. You planned the theft, planted the button to suggest Arthur's guilt, and timed your movements to ensure Clara appeared suspicious. The note left at Winterbrook Lodge was your communication, designed to mislead anyone who might investigate too closely. A tremor ran through the room. Lydia's eyes darted toward the floor. I only wanted. I thought if I could move the funds, I could fix things. Fix things? Evelyn asked softly. Yes, Lydia whispered. The manor owes more than the village knows. Some villagers, some debts from long ago. I thought if I could secure the funds temporarily, I could settle the accounts without anyone knowing. I never meant for anyone to be blamed or hurt. Miss Marple's gaze was firm but compassionate. Intentions and actions are not always the same, Lydia. You must understand that though your plan was clever, it placed suspicion upon innocent people and disrupted the village community. Lydia's shoulders slumped. I understand. I only wanted to help. Help can take many forms, Miss Marple said gently. But it is always better to act openly. Now, with the ledger returned and the deception revealed, we can restore order and trust in St. Mary Mead. Arthur Fletcher exhaled, relief evident. I am glad this is finally clear. Clara Whitford nodded slowly, still shaken but relieved. Evelyn Pierce's eyes were bright with gratitude. and Miss Marple, though quietly pleased with her deductions, allowed the group a moment to absorb the revelation. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, covering the village in a pristine blanket once more. Inside Frost Hollow Manor, the truth had emerged, unmasking the careful deception and returning harmony to the quiet community. Miss Marple observed them all with a gentle smile. Justice had been served not through anger or accusation, but through careful observation, patience, and the subtle unraveling of misdirection. And with that, the village, though shaken, would begin to heal. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Gentle Resolutions. The morning sun filtered softly through the frost-laced windows of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting long, delicate shadows across the lace curtains. The snow outside glistened like tiny diamonds under the pale winter light, and the village of St. Mary Mead appeared at peace once more. Inside, the air was warm with the comforting aroma of fresh tea and baked scones, a quiet contrast to the tensions of the past week. Miss Marple sat at her small table pouring steaming tea into delicate cups, and reflected on the events that had finally reached their conclusion. The previous evening had been decisive. Lydia Marsh's carefully orchestrated plan had been revealed at Frost Hollow Manor, the hidden ledger restored, and the misdirection of the brass button exposed. Arthur Fletcher had been cleared, Clara Whitford's nervous presence understood, and Evelyn Pierce reassured that her meticulous honesty had not gone unnoticed. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Justice had been served through observation, reasoning, and gentle persuasion rather than harsh confrontation. There was a soft knock at the door, and Clara Whitford stepped inside, cheeks flushed from the crisp morning air. She carried a small parcel of freshly baked bread, which she placed with a grateful smile on the table. "I thought perhaps this might accompany tea," she said. "An excellent idea, my dear," Miss Marple replied warmly. "Please join me. There is always room for another friend at tea." Clara seated herself, smoothing her hands over her lap. "Miss Marple, I cannot thank you enough for yesterday. I feared I had been implicated unfairly, and yet your careful attention revealed the truth before any harm could come." "You acted admirably," Miss Marple said gently. "Often the best approach is to remain calm and observe. Panic seldom aids understanding, and in a village such as ours, small details, footsteps in the snow, the movement of a button, the subtle habits of those around us, speak volumes." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "I had no idea someone could manipulate events so subtly. I felt watched, as though the walls themselves were aware of intentions hidden from plain sight." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "The quiet observer sees more than the hurried gossip ever will. That is the distinction between mere suspicion and true understanding." She poured another cup of tea, the steam curling gracefully above the rim. "And now, with the ledger returned, the village can breathe easily once more." Evelyn Pierce entered shortly after, bringing with her a small tin of sugar biscuits, which she placed neatly beside the teapot. "Good morning," she said, smiling shyly. "I thought perhaps I could help with tea as thanks for everything you did." "Kind of you, Evelyn," Miss Marple said. "And it is heartening to see your spirits lifted. The ledger's restoration and the exposure of the misdirection were handled delicately, and I trust you feel more secure now." Evelyn nodded. "Yes, much more. I understand now that the small things I observed, the misplaced note, the subtle hints of someone's movements, were all crucial. I must remember to trust my own perceptions as well as the counsel of those more experienced." The room filled with a sense of gentle camaraderie. Outside, the snow continued to shimmer, but the village itself seemed almost suspended in peaceful reflection, aware that the disturbances of recent days had been resolved without discord or accusation. Miss Marple sipped her tea and regarded her companions with a quiet satisfaction. Lydia Marsh had confessed willingly, her motives rooted in a desire to correct perceived injustices rather than greed or malice. Arthur Fletcher had been reassured of his innocence, and Clara and Evelyn had learned that appearances, however, misleading, could be understood with patience and careful observation. "I should think," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that the lesson here is not merely about honesty or guilt, but about awareness. The village functions because each person, knowingly or not, follows routines, observes patterns, and contributes to the community. When one person attempts to manipulate that web, subtle disruptions occur, yet they can also be traced by those who notice the smallest details." Clara smiled, a sense of relief softening her features. "It is comforting to know that St. Mary Mead is resilient. Even when mistakes or misjudgments arise, the truth can be restored with care and attention." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "And it is also a reminder that our judgments must always be tempered with patience. Rushing to conclusions can obscure the real patterns hidden in plain sight." She gestured to the window where the snow sparkled in the gentle morning light. "Look at the snow, my dears. It covers everything indiscriminately, yet underneath traces remain. Footprints, small disturbances, and faint imprints. They tell a story if one knows how to read them." Evelyn nodded, her gaze thoughtful, like the brass button outside the hall window. "At first I assumed guilt lay with Arthur, but your careful reasoning revealed the true sequence of events." Miss Marple smiled. "Precisely. And it is in such moments, when one allows observation to lead reasoning rather than emotion, that clarity emerges." She poured another cup of tea and set it before Clara. "Now let us enjoy this quiet moment, for the village is at peace once more. Snow and warmth, tea and conversation. These are the things that restore not only the body but the heart." They sipped their tea in companionable silence, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the faint rustle of wind against the windows. Outside, St. Mary Mead seemed untouched by the complications of the past week, yet inside the sitting room, warmth, understanding, and gentle resolution prevailed. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of events that had brought them to this point. A stolen ledger, a brass button, misdirection, anxious villagers, and subtle clues, all combined to form a mystery that, though clever, had ultimately been resolved through careful observation, patience, and quiet reasoning. The snow had hidden the tracks at first, but like all things in nature and human behavior, the patterns remained, waiting for the perceptive eye. Clara, Evelyn, and even Arthur Fletcher, who had joined them for a short while, began to share stories of minor village mishaps and everyday gossip, laughter easing the lingering tension. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The village was restored, and its people reminded that truth, though sometimes obscured, could always be revealed with care and attention. Finally, as the sun rose higher and the morning deepened, Miss Marple concluded the gathering. She poured one last cup of tea for herself, savoring the warmth and tranquility of the room. Outside, St. Mary Mead sparkled under the winter light, peaceful once again. The betrayal had been uncovered, the guilty party confronted, and the village's harmony restored. Miss Marple lifted her cup gently, raising it in a quiet toast to understanding, observation, and the gentle wisdom that comes with years of watching both people and the world around them. And with that, she sipped her tea, letting the warmth settle over her, content in the knowledge that the village of St. Mary Mead had survived the storm of human cunning, stronger, wiser, and closer than before.